Hey friends, I'm Megan, so glad you're here. We've got a great episode today. Let's get started.
She always believed she knew best from the very first months of their marriage. She positioned herself as the sensible one, the pragmatic partner who could always be relied upon to steer their small family through life's uncertainties. He, on the other hand, had an artist spirit trapped in the routine world of 9-to-5 jobs and dinner table bills. He would stay up late, scribbling down his wild ideas on scraps of paper, humming to himself, eyes alight with excitement over some new concept that, to her, seemed as fleeting as a child's daydream. She watched him sometimes with a mixture of fondness and frustration, wondering how someone could be so smart and yet so naive about the ways of the real world. Whenever family or friends gathered for birthdays or holidays, the conversation would inevitably drift to careers and plans for the future. She always found herself explaining, half laughing, half exasperated, about his latest entrepreneurial obsession. Her words, though playful on the surface, always carried an undertone of sharpness, an unspoken warning that such childishness had a time limit. Her mother would sigh and nod in agreement, her friends would snicker quietly, and she would bask in the approval, certain that her skepticism was a form of love, a necessary corrective to his airy ambitions. If he felt the sting of her jokes, he rarely let it show. Instead, he would smile, squeeze her hand, and quietly return to his sketches and notes, seemingly undeterred by her disapproval. In her own mind, she framed her attitude as practical support. Someone had to keep their feet on the ground, pay the bills, ensure the fridge was full and the rent was always on time. She managed their budget with clinical precision, carefully noting every expense, frowning whenever an unexpected charge appeared. She worked hard at her job, rarely took a day off, always striving for the next promotion, the next tangible marker of progress. It was not that she disliked his creativity. She found it charming, in moderation, but she resented how often it distracted him from what she considered the real work of adulthood. Each time he floated a new idea, a new dream of a business that would change their lives, she could feel her patience fraying just a little more. It wasn't that she wanted to hurt him. She cared for him in her way, and she worried about him even as she rolled her eyes at his optimism. Sometimes, late at night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying their conversations in her head, wondering if she had been too harsh. She would promise herself to be kinder, more encouraging, but by morning the practicalities of life would crowd out her softer feelings. There were bills to pay, bosses to please, chores to finish, no time for flights of fancy. She told herself, again and again, that she was only doing what was necessary for their future. Yet, with each passing month, a subtle shift occurred between them. Where once she had felt pride in their partnership, now she felt annoyance, even embarrassment. When friends asked about his latest project, she would answer with a smirk, as if to say, "Can you believe it? Still chasing rainbows at his age." The laughter of others became a small reward, a validation of her worldview, even as it chipped away at something vulnerable within her marriage. She didn't notice how his eyes would darken for a moment, how his shoulders would tense, how he would turn his attention back to his notebooks with a little more determination, a little more distance. She grew impatient with his routines. The messy kitchen after his late-night brainstorming, the piles of books about marketing and entrepreneurship that seemed to multiply on every surface, the endless hours spent on online forums with strangers who encouraged his dreams instead of grounding him in reality. She started spending more time out of the house, lingering at work, joining her friends for drinks, relishing the moments when she didn't have to play the responsible spouse. At home, she sighed more, her words sharper, her tolerance thinning. She wondered why he couldn't just be satisfied with the life they had built. Why he had to keep chasing after the next big thing. Still, she kept telling herself that this was only a phase, that eventually he would settle down and focus on a steady job, on the small and quiet comforts of a normal life. She ignored the growing sense of disconnection between them, the way he seemed to retreat further into himself, finding solace in his dreams and ambitions rather than in her company. The more she mocked his efforts, the harder he worked, and the harder he worked, the more resentful she became. It was a cycle neither of them seemed able to break. Every so often, she would recall the early days of their relationship, when his creativity had enchanted her, when his wild ideas had seemed charming rather than childish. She wondered what had changed. Was it him? Or was it her? But such questions were uncomfortable, so she buried them beneath a mountain of practical concerns. She convinced herself that love meant pushing someone to do better, to be more realistic, to grow up. She couldn't see that. In her quest to help him, she was slowly eroding the very foundation of their bond. As the weeks turned into months, her skepticism hardened into scorn. She barely noticed the small victories he celebrated, the positive feedback from a mentor, the minor but real successes online. To her, these were distractions, delays on the road to a responsible adulthood. She believed that, sooner or later, reality would catch up with him and he would thank her for keeping them afloat, for being the one who never lost sight of what truly mattered. What she failed to realize was that, in her certainty, she was blind to a world of possibility unfolding just beyond her reach. A world that, soon enough, would leave her behind. The tension in their home began as a silent undercurrent, invisible to outsiders but pulsing through every shared moment. Days that once held the comfort of routine were now colored by small irritations, by the sense that their lives were traveling down separate tracks. She would come home late from work, shoulders tight from the day, to find him hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, surrounded by notes and empty coffee cups. The apartment felt smaller, more crowded, as if his ideas took up more space than he did. She tried to ignore the ache of disappointment that settled in her chest, tried to convince herself that this was just another of his fleeting obsessions, destined to burn out like all the others. But this time, he was different. Instead of backing down in the face of her skepticism, he seemed to double down, pouring more hours into his project, talking less and working more. He started reaching out to others, strangers online who understood his vision, who offered support and feedback where she gave only doubt. It was as if he had found a lifeline outside their marriage. And every late night spent at his screen widened the distance between them. She could feel him slipping away, bit by bit, but she was too proud to admit that her words might be pushing him rather than helping. Money grew tighter as his focus shifted from stable income to risky ventures. She felt the weight of responsibility press even heavier on her shoulders. Bills arrived in the mail, reminders of the life they had built together, a life that suddenly felt precarious, as if it could all crumble with a single misstep. Her anxiety, once a faint hum, grew louder with every passing week. She watched the numbers in their bank account dwindle and began to tally every expense. Every coffee he bought, every new subscription or book. The thought of what might happen if his gamble failed haunted her dreams. She saw herself stranded, abandoned by his foolish hope. Her frustration erupted in small, pointed comments, in sighs that seemed to last forever, in glances that lingered a moment too long on his growing pile of notes. Sometimes, unable to contain her anger, she would snap, questioning his choices with a sharpness she barely recognized as her own. She began to resent the way he looked at her, not with love, but with a steely resolve that excluded her, as if he were preparing for battle against the very person he once trusted most. The warmth of their partnership faded into a chilly formality. A set of routines maintained only because neither of them knew what else to do. One evening, after another fruitless discussion, the conflict reached its peak. She listed her grievances, her fears, the burdens she felt forced to carry alone. Her voice trembled with exhaustion and rage. He listened quietly, eyes fixed on the table, the silence between them more damning than any words could have been. She demanded answers, demanded that he explain himself, demanded that he choose between the world they had built and the fantasies that threatened to destroy it. The words hung in the air, echoing through the small apartment, impossible to take back. She knew, even as she spoke, that something had shifted, something fragile had finally broken. Afterward, the house felt emptier, even when both of them were present. He began to withdraw, closing himself off, hiding behind the work that once brought them together. The laughter and small touches that once filled their evenings disappeared, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to stretch endlessly from one day to the next. She longed for the comfort of their old intimacy, but pride kept her from reaching out. Instead, she poured her energy into her own life, into her work, into maintaining a sense of control in a world that suddenly felt unsteady. She spent longer hours at the office, volunteered for extra projects, and found herself looking for excuses to stay away from home. Yet, even in her absence, she could not escape the feeling that she was losing him. She began to notice the way he changed, how his once tentative steps grew firmer, how the doubts she used to detect in his posture faded away. There was a new confidence in the way he moved, a sense of purpose that she both admired and resented. He spoke less, but when he did, there was a quiet certainty to his words, as if he no longer needed her approval to pursue his dreams. She realized, with a painful clarity, that she was no longer the center of his universe. This realization only deepened her anger. She clung to the routines of their life, as if by sheer force of will she could pull him back from the edge of whatever chasm he was approaching. She made ultimatums, set boundaries, drew lines in the sand that he seemed determined to ignore. The more she tried to assert control, the more he slipped away, until finally she felt like a stranger in her own home. The turning point came quietly, almost without warning. One morning, she woke to find the apartment unusually still. His side of the bed was empty, his notes neatly stacked, his laptop closed. She waited, expecting him to return with an apology, a promise to be more present, to put their life first, but hours passed, and he did not come home. She felt the chill of uncertainty settle over her, the terrifying possibility that this time, he might really be gone. In the days that followed, she grappled with regret, anger, and the deep ache of loneliness. She told herself she had done what was necessary, that she could not let him drag them both into ruin for the sake of a dream. Yet, beneath her justifications, she could not silence the small, persistent voice that whispered of what she had lost. Not just a husband, but a partner, a friend, the possibility of a different kind of life. The house, once filled with tension, was now simply empty. She wandered from room to room, haunted by the echoes of arguments, by the memories of a laughter that seemed to belong to someone else. She looked at herself in the mirror and wondered when she had become so hard, so unwilling to believe in hope. She questioned whether she had ever really listened to him, or if she had simply been too afraid to risk failure, too invested in her own certainty to allow for the messiness of dreams. The silence of their apartment pressed in on her, a reminder of all the things she had said, and all the things she had left unsaid. In that stillness, she began to understand that the true cost of her skepticism was not measured in money or security, but in the slow, silent erosion of love itself. She had always imagined that independence would feel exhilarating, a liberating surge of relief after years of shouldering someone else's burdens. Yet, as she watched him walk out the door for the last time, his footsteps echoing down the hall, the first sensation was not freedom but a hollow ache that gnawed at her from within. The apartment, once cramped by the presence of his papers and his dreams, now felt cavernous and cold. In the silence that followed his departure, she moved through the rooms like a ghost, brushing her fingertips along forgotten surfaces, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the floorboards. She told herself this was temporary, that he would come to his senses and call her, apologize, offer some small concession that would allow her to maintain the illusion of control. Days blended together as she struggled to adjust to a new reality she had never wanted but felt. Powerless to resist, she threw herself into her work, arriving early and leaving late, hoping that productivity would fill the void his absence had left behind. The office became her refuge, a place where she could lose herself in spreadsheets and emails, where the only voices she heard were the ones that praised her for her diligence and efficiency. Colleagues remarked on her newfound focus, admiring her dedication without realizing it was born from desperation. She smiled when required, joined after-work drinks when invited, but always felt like an outsider, cut off from the easy warmth of the friendships that others seemed to nurture so effortlessly. Her mother welcomed her back without judgment, preparing the spare room in the house where she had grown up. Returning home was meant to be a comfort, a chance to reset and recover. Instead, it brought a fresh wave of humiliation and regret. Each evening, as she walked through the familiar hallway and into her childhood bedroom, she was reminded of everything she had left behind. The trophies on the shelves and faded posters on the wall stood as silent witnesses to her failures. She tried to justify her choices in conversations with her mother, rehearsing arguments about responsibility and reason. But even she grew weary of the sound of her own rationalizations. In the quiet moments before sleep, doubts crept in, whispering that perhaps she had misjudged him, that perhaps she had misjudged herself. She noticed the subtle shifts in her own habits. No longer responsible for anyone but herself, she let routines unravel. Mornings lost their urgency. She lingered over coffee, scrolled endlessly through social media, searching for glimpses of a world that had once felt within reach. Sometimes she found herself scrolling through old photos, searching his face for signs she might have missed, moments where happiness had flickered between them before being smothered by her skepticism. His laughter, captured forever in pixels, haunted her. She tried to remember the last time she had seen that light in his eyes, the last time she had truly listened to his hopes without dismissing them as childish fantasies. Financial realities set in slowly but relentlessly. Without his contribution, her paycheck barely stretched to cover her share of the rent and the bills that continued to arrive. Like clockwork, she cut expenses where she could, skipping lunches out, canceling subscriptions. But the numbers in her account dwindled all the same. Pride kept her from asking for help, but she could not hide the strain. Her wardrobe grew shabby, her car developed new and inexplicable rattles, and she found herself dreading the end of each month. She wondered if this was what adulthood truly meant. A slow surrender to inevitability, a narrowing of horizons until only survival remained. Her friends, at first supportive and eager to offer advice, began to drift away. Invitations grew infrequent. She overheard snippets of conversations, caught sideways glances at gatherings, sensed the invisible line that now separated her from those whose lives seemed blessedly uncomplicated. The isolation stung. She began to avoid social events altogether, preferring the comfort of solitude to the pain of comparing herself to others. In the darkness of her room, she catalogued her mistakes, replaying each conversation and argument, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when hope had slipped through her fingers. Guilt and resentment coiled within her, feeding off each other, impossible to untangle. As weeks stretched into months, memories of their life together resurfaced with greater clarity. She remembered the nights spent talking in the kitchen long after midnight, the shared dreams and secret jokes that had once bound them together. She wondered how much of that intimacy had been real, and how much had been an illusion built on her need for control. She recognized now, with painful honesty, that her attempts to shape him into someone he was not had been motivated not by love, but by fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of vulnerability, fear of admitting that she did not have all the answers. In her mother's house, surrounded by relics of her past, she found herself longing for the future she had once envisioned, a future that seemed forever out of reach. The prospect of starting over felt daunting, yet she could not ignore the faint stirrings of possibility beneath the grief. For the first time, she questioned the beliefs that had guided her decisions, wondered if perhaps there was another way to live, one that allowed for mistakes and forgiveness and the wild, unpredictable beauty of dreams. Yet she remained paralyzed, caught between regret and fear, unable to move forward, unable to let go. News of his progress trickled in through mutual friends and the impersonal world of social media. At first, she ignored the updates, dismissing them as irrelevant to her new life. But curiosity proved irresistible. She found herself searching for his name, reading articles about his project, seeing his face in photos with strangers who now shared his vision. The world she had once mocked had opened its doors to him, and he had stepped through with a confidence she barely recognized. Each new success stung, a reminder of what she had lost, of what she had refused to believe was possible. She wondered, late at night, whether he thought of her at all, whether he remembered the years they had shared, or whether he had already moved beyond her shadow. She imagined reaching out, offering an apology or an explanation, but pride held her back. Instead, she remained suspended in limbo, haunted by memories of what might have been, by the quiet certainty that in trying to save herself, she had lost far more than she could ever recover. The first whispers of his success reached her as distant, almost unbelievable rumors. At first, she dismissed them, assuming they were exaggerations or wishful thinking on the part of mutual friends who had always admired his wild ambition. Yet as the days passed, the news became impossible to ignore. His name began to appear in social media posts, tagged by people she didn't know, accompanied by photos of him standing on brightly lit stages, addressing crowds, shaking hands with people whose faces she recognized from magazines and online articles. There were videos, too, clips circulating with thousands of views, snippets of interviews in which he spoke with a newfound ease and authority, explaining ideas she had once laughed at over their small kitchen table. Each new notification sent a wave of confusion and disbelief through her, as if she were watching a stranger's life unfold with uncanny familiarity. Soon, his story was everywhere. News sites published articles about the innovative business he had built from scratch, focusing on the way he had persevered through doubt and rejection to finally bring his vision to life. She scrolled through interviews in which he spoke candidly about obstacles and setbacks, never mentioning her by name but alluding to the skepticism he had faced, the loneliness of chasing a dream when no one else believed. In those moments, she felt both exposed and invisible, a supporting character in the narrative of his triumph, erased from the glossy version of events but unable to escape the truth of her role. Friends and acquaintances who had once shared her dismissive attitude toward his ambitions now spoke of him with awe and admiration. She watched as people recalibrated their memories, recalling how they had always seen his potential, how they had cheered him on from the very beginning. The same faces that once smirked at her stories of his failed projects now boasted of their connections, eager to bask in the glow of his success. At gatherings, conversations inevitably turned to him. His latest breakthrough, the interviews he'd given, the awards he was beginning to receive. She smiled through clenched teeth, nodding as if she too were proud and happy for him, all the while feeling the sharp sting of humiliation gnaw at her insides. Her mother, once her staunchest ally, grew quiet on the subject, offering only soft platitudes when the topic arose. Even she could not ignore the obvious. He had achieved what he set out to do, and she, who had claimed to know better, was left to contemplate the ruins of her certainty. Alone in her childhood bedroom, she stared at the ceiling, replaying old arguments and dismissive comments, wondering how many opportunities for encouragement she had squandered in favor of cold practicality. Regret pressed on her chest like a physical weight, heavy and unrelenting. As his success continued to grow, so too did the gulf between the life she had imagined and the reality she now inhabited. Each headline, each congratulatory post, each new story of his generosity or brilliance served as a mirror, reflecting back the consequences of her choices. She began to question her own motivations, probing the insecurities and fears that had driven her to belittle his dreams. Had she been so desperate for control that she had sacrificed the possibility of something greater? Had her skepticism been a shield against disappointment, or merely an excuse to avoid vulnerability? There were moments when she tried to rationalize, to remind herself of all the reasons she had doubted him. The failed ventures, the financial strain, the endless late nights spent chasing elusive solutions. Yet those arguments rang hollow in the face of his achievements. She watched him transform from the man she had known, restless, uncertain, brimming with ideas, into someone self-assured and magnetic. Someone who had learned to turn rejection into fuel for ambition. In photographs, his eyes sparkled with a confidence that was both familiar and strange, a quality she had glimpsed only occasionally, and never so brightly. Rumors of a new relationship began to circulate, adding a fresh layer of bitterness to her regret. She saw him at events, accompanied by someone elegant and poised, a partner who seemed to understand and share his world. Their photos together, smiling, confident, undeniably happy, spread quickly through the networks she still frequented. Each new image felt like a rebuke, a reminder that life moved forward with or without her participation. In the privacy of her own thoughts, she allowed herself to imagine what might have been. She pictured a life in which she had supported him, believed in his vision, stood beside him through setbacks and small victories. Would things have been different if she had encouraged rather than dismissed, listened rather than laughed? The questions haunted her, echoing in the silence of her room and in the gaps between conversations with friends and family. Even as she tried to avoid news of him, his presence seemed inescapable. Colleagues at work mentioned his success, unaware or indifferent to her connection to him. Former friends reached out with awkward messages, asking if she had heard the news, if she was all right. She replied with practiced indifference, feigning disinterest even as her heart raced with every mention of his name. Her pride, wounded and raw, kept her from confiding in anyone. Instead, she carried the burden alone, allowing it to shape her days and color her nights. Financial struggles persisted, intensifying the contrast between their diverging paths. While he appeared on magazine covers and enjoyed the fruits of his perseverance, she continued to count every penny, budgeting carefully and making sacrifices that felt increasingly futile. The knowledge that she had once shared his dreams, that she had once been his confidant and partner, made her isolation all the more acute. She wondered if he ever thought of her, if he remembered the promises they had made and the hopes they had shared before everything unraveled. As his star rose higher, she withdrew further, reluctant to expose herself to pity or judgment. She avoided gatherings where his name might be mentioned, retreated from friendships that could not withstand the weight of her regret. She became, in a way, invisible, an observer on the outskirts of a story that had once belonged to her. Yet even in her isolation, she could not escape the relentless march of time, the steady accumulation of successes that marked his journey away from their shared past. Late at night, when the world was quiet and the distractions of the day had faded, she allowed herself to grieve, not just for the loss of her marriage, but for the loss of possibility, of belief, of wonder. She understood now that her skepticism had been a form of fear, a refusal to trust in something she could not control or predict. She saw, with painful clarity, the difference between caution and cynicism, between love and possessiveness. In the end, it was not his ambition that had come between them, but her unwillingness to dream alongside him. Each morning, as she woke to the familiar surroundings of her mother's house, she faced the knowledge that the life she had so carefully planned was gone. In its place was something uncharted, a landscape shaped by regret, but also, perhaps, by the first tentative stirrings of humility. She did not know what the future held, only that the past could not be changed, and that the price of certainty had been higher than she had ever imagined. She lingered at the edge of her own life, hesitant and uncertain, the shape of every day dictated by routine and regret. The reminders of his success had become inescapable, woven into conversations with her mother, overheard at the market, glimpsed in headlines that she could no longer ignore. Each mention carried a peculiar sting, equal parts pride and shame, a gnawing awareness that she was merely a spectator to what had once been their shared future. The more his achievements grew, the more acutely she felt her own failures. Not just as a partner but as a person. She wondered, with a heaviness that dulled her every thought, whether redemption was even possible after all that had passed. Time, which she had once hoped would heal or numb her, instead seemed to conspire against her, stretching out each day with reminders of what could have been. There were moments when she caught herself rehearsing conversations in her mind, imagining what she would say if she saw him again, how she would explain herself, apologize, justify, plead for understanding. The words always dissolved before they reached her lips, replaced by a cold, paralyzing fear of rejection. She recalled all the times she had mocked or dismissed him, the way she had drawn lines between possibility and responsibility, and wondered if any apology could ever undo the damage. Yet the desire for connection, for absolution, refused to leave her. It became a quiet ache beneath her skin, urging her toward action she could no longer resist. One evening, unable to bear the weight of her isolation any longer, she found herself dialing his number, her hands trembling with anticipation and dread. The ring echoed in her ears, each second stretched taut by the possibility that he might answer, or that he might not. When the call went to voicemail, she left a halting, awkward message, her voice barely above a whisper, apologizing for her past words and asking if he might be willing to meet. Just once. To talk. She waited for a reply that did not come, her hope fading with each silent hour. Days passed. She tried again, this time writing an email, more composed but no less vulnerable, laying bare her regrets and longing. Still, there was no response. The world outside seemed indifferent to her efforts. And yet she persisted, driven by the faint hope that forgiveness might still be possible. In her desperation, she found herself replaying memories from their marriage. Small, mundane moments when kindness had passed between them. Fleeting gestures that had once seemed insignificant but now shone with a painful clarity. She clung to these recollections, searching for evidence that love had not been entirely erased by bitterness and pride. Eventually, after weeks of silence, a reply appeared in her inbox. Brief, courteous, yet distant. He agreed to meet, but only for a short coffee. his tone polite but guarded. She dressed with care, anxiety simmering beneath her calm exterior. As she approached the cafe, her heart pounded with anticipation. He was already there, seated by the window, a picture of composure and success. The contrast between them was impossible to ignore. She hesitated before entering, steeling herself for the encounter. The conversation was stilted, awkward, heavy with unspoken questions and buried hurt. He answered her inquiries politely, shared updates on his work, and spoke with genuine enthusiasm about new projects and partnerships. She listened, struggling to reconcile the man before her with the one she had known. The dreamer she had doubted, now transformed by confidence and achievement. She tried to apologize, her words stumbling over themselves. But he stopped her gently, assuring her that he had moved on, that the past was behind him. There was no anger in his voice, only a calm acceptance that stung more than any accusation could have. As she left the cafe, a wave of humiliation washed over her, mingled with a profound sense of loss. She realized that what she sought, a return to the safety of their old life, a restoration of what once was, could never be reclaimed. He had built a new world for himself, one in which she was only a distant memory, a closed chapter. The finality of that truth settled over her like a shadow, stripping away the last vestiges of hope. She returned to her mother's house that night, her steps slow and uncertain. Her mother welcomed her with quiet concern, asking no questions, offering comfort in silence. In the sanctuary of her childhood room, she allowed herself to grieve fully for the first time, not just for the loss of her marriage but for the loss of possibility, for the ways she had sabotaged her own happiness out of fear and pride. She thought of the paths not taken, the encouragement never given, the dreams dismissed before they had the chance to blossom. Every memory, every regret, pressed down on her, and she wept. Not for him, but for the person she might have been, had she chosen trust over cynicism, kindness over judgment. In the weeks that followed, she drifted through life in a haze, her thoughts circling endlessly around the encounter. She replayed his words, his expressions, searching for hidden meaning, for any sign that forgiveness or reconnection might still be possible. But the clarity of his composure, the assurance in his new life, left her with only one conclusion. She could not go back. The only way forward was through acceptance, through the painful but necessary work of letting go. Yet the ache lingered, a persistent reminder of everything she had lost, a wound that refused to heal. The world around her continued on, oblivious to her struggles. Her mother encouraged her to look for new work, to build a routine, to seek out small joys and victories. She tried, but the spark that had once driven her seemed dimmed, her ambitions rendered meaningless in the face of what she had forfeited. There were moments of clarity, brief glimpses of possibility, a walk in the park, a kind word from a stranger, the scent of rain on pavement, that hinted at a future she might still shape, if only she could find the strength to begin again. Gradually, she recognized that the path to healing would be long and uncertain, that the wounds of the past could not be erased by a single conversation or gesture. She understood, finally, that forgiveness, both of herself and of him, was not a destination but a journey, one that required patience, humility, and the willingness to believe in the possibility of change. As she stood at the window each evening, watching the sun set over the familiar streets of her childhood, she resolved to begin the slow process of rebuilding a life that could one day accommodate hope. The days that followed seemed to blend into one another, marked less by events than by the gradual shifting of her inner landscape. At first, she moved through them with mechanical precision, completing necessary tasks, attending to obligations, but always carrying with her the heaviness of regret and the quiet, persistent ache of loss. she had expected. Perhaps that time alone would bring a sudden moment of clarity or a surge of motivation. But what greeted her instead was the slow, almost imperceptible unfurling of perspective. It was not a dramatic epiphany, but rather the gentle erosion of old certainties and the emergence of a softer, more open way of seeing herself and the world around her. Mornings began with small acts of care. A cup of coffee sipped by the window. A brief walk through the neighborhood. The sunlight casting patterns across the floor of her childhood room. The routines that once felt burdensome or insignificant now became anchors. Quiet affirmations that life continued. Even in the face of disappointment, she started to pay attention to the details she had once overlooked. The chirping of birds in the early hours. The changing colors of the sky. The warmth of her mother's embrace as they passed in the hallway. There was something grounding in these moments. Something that hinted at the possibility of comfort and renewal. If only she could be patient with herself. Gradually, she found herself drawn to the world outside her own sorrow. She noticed the kindness of strangers at the market, the resilience of people she passed on the street, the way children laughed without self-consciousness. She began volunteering at a local shelter. Hesitant at first but soon discovering a quiet satisfaction in helping others whose struggles, while different from her own, were no less real. The work demanded little and offered much in return. A sense of purpose, of belonging, of being useful in ways she had not felt in years. It was through these acts of service that she began to understand the value of humility. The quiet dignity of giving and receiving help without judgment or expectation. Her relationship with her mother deepened in unexpected ways. Their conversations, once stilted by tension and unspoken disappointment, became gentler, more honest. She found herself sharing memories she had never spoken aloud. Moments of happiness and pain, hopes for the future, fears that still lingered in the corners of her mind. Her mother listened with patience, offering comfort when needed but never pushing her to move faster than she was able. Together, they found a new rhythm. One built on acceptance rather than expectation. It was during this period of reflection and slow healing that she revisited her own dreams. The ones she had shelved long before her marriage began to unravel. She unearthed old notebooks filled with sketches and ideas, relics of a time when her imagination had run wild and unencumbered by doubt. At first, she felt foolish for hoping that anything meaningful could come from those pages. But curiosity soon replaced embarrassment. She began to tinker, to explore new skills and hobbies. Painting, writing, learning a new language, not for the sake of achievement, but for the pleasure of discovery itself. In these moments, she glimpsed the woman she might have become if fear and pride had not taken hold. Her interactions with the outside world became bolder. If still tentative, she joined a book club, attended community events, slowly building a network of acquaintances who knew nothing of her past and saw her only as she was. In the present, it was liberating to be judged on her own merits, to be free from the weight of former mistakes. For the first time in years, she began to envision a future that was not defined by what she had lost, but by what she could still create. Forgiveness, both of herself and of him, did not arrive as a single revelation. Instead, it came in fragments, an unexpected surge of gratitude for the lessons learned, a willingness to see the past not as a series of failures, but as the necessary path to growth. She allowed herself to revisit memories of their time together, this time with compassion rather than bitterness. She acknowledged the love that had once existed, as well as the mistakes that had led to its unraveling. In doing so, she discovered a sense of peace she had never thought possible. Her financial situation remained uncertain, but she approached it with newfound resourcefulness and calm. She found a part-time job at a local shop, supplemented by freelance work she secured through contacts made at the shelter. The work was neither glamorous nor highly paid, but it offered stability and a sense of progress. Each paycheck, each completed project, became a marker of her resilience, evidence that she could sustain herself through her own efforts. Pride was replaced by quiet satisfaction, a steady confidence that no longer depended on comparison to anyone else. As the seasons changed, so too did her outlook. She found herself laughing more easily, savoring moments of connection, seeking out beauty in small, everyday things. She made new friends, slowly and without expectation, allowing relationships to develop naturally, without the desperate need for approval or validation. She learned to trust herself again, to believe in the possibility of happiness not despite her past, but because of it. One afternoon, as she walked through the city park, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The pain of loss was still present, a faint ache beneath the surface, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it served as a reminder of the cost of certainty, of the importance of vulnerability and openness. She understood now that love was not a matter of control or possession, but of trust, encouragement, and acceptance. She was grateful for the lessons, hard-earned though they were, and resolved to carry them forward into whatever new chapter awaited her. Looking back, she saw not only the mistakes and regrets, but also the courage it had taken to begin again. She realized that she was not alone in her struggles, that everyone carried wounds and scars, and that healing was a process without a fixed timeline or predetermined outcome. There would be setbacks and disappointments, moments of doubt and longing, but also moments of joy, hope, and discovery. She was, at last, ready to embrace the uncertainty of the future, knowing that she possessed the strength to shape her own story. Day by day, step by step, in this new beginning, she found not only redemption, but a quiet, abiding sense of grace. She no longer needed to beg for acceptance, to seek validation from those who could not give it. Instead, she chose to move forward with humility and courage, trusting that life, in all its unpredictability, still held the possibility of happiness. She was not defined by the past, nor limited by her failures. She was, simply and finally, herself, wiser, stronger, and open to the endless unfolding of what was still to come.
Thanks for watching. It means a lot. Share the video, and I'll see you soon.